Hello, everyone. Welcome to another screening series Q&A. My name is Camelia Shofani, and I'm the Senior Manager of Public Programs and Events here at the International Documentary Association. For our blind or low vision attendees, I have dark curly hair, light skin, dark eyes, and a soft beige sweater. I'd like to thank our sponsors, KCRW and Variety, for making this possible. Please visit documentary.org/screening-series for more information on our Q&A and lineups. This evening, we'll be having a conversation between moderator Tim Cogshell and filmmaker Elvis Mitchell, whose film Is That Black Enough for You? Premiered at the New York Film Festival earlier this year. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a brief land acknowledgement. We recognize the Gabrielino Tongva as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and cultural resources in the unceded territory of Los Angeles. Thank you.
I did. First of all, I'm from St. Louis. I think you hail from Detroit.
I do.
I got plenty of people up in Detroit. That whole run from Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, right on down south. That whole stretch is that diaspora from where a good many of our folks came from.
Yes.
And look, I won't call out your age, but I'll tell you, I'm 61. I was born in 1961. I'm 61. And
I got a year on you, but we're up there.
There's something about this generation, and you tell me if this might be true. Our generation, who grew up watching many of those things that you frame this film with, you begin this film with those images, Stymie, Shirley Temple dancing with Bill Robinson, stepping. As a child, we grew up watching those things. They were a normal part of our television and entertainment landscape. And of course, our generation, experienced this entire transition that you walk through in your extraordinary document. Is that black enough for you? And by the way, it is. It's black.
Well, we're done here. Thank you. We're all finished. Thank you.
It's what we used to call jet black back in.
It is. So we're all drive safe, everybody. Good night.
Blacker than blacker than blacker than black. I love it, and it's a fantastic film. Is there something about our generation that positions you specifically, perfectly, to cover this period? Because it really has been our period.
Gee, I mean, I don't know, because as you're saying these things, I realize that you're right, that there was a pivot point. Because that era where these things were basically this received wisdom, that this is the way Black people were seen on screen. And it's actually, remember as a kid, I'd see stuff like, because all these movies were dictated by the Hays Code, you see a white couple and married couple in bed in two separate beds, and you just watch it and you go, white people are crazy. This is so weird. Because you never saw Black people like that, so we just made these assumptions that, that's what white people did, and it was odd. It didn't make any sense to me. And so to see that stuff at the same time that the world is changing, that between the rise of the militant class and Black revolutionary thought, which is repudiating all that stuff and saying no to it, at the same time, it's still being offered as this constant stream of this is what Black life was like for those entertainers, not in the real world. It was a period that forced us to ask questions. As critical thinkers, especially people of color, we're constantly asking ourselves about what is not there. And then people were saying, well, this is what was not there. Then that era was starting to take shape and change the conversation we had as viewers of what we were shown. So you also got that great example, and I wanted to make sure this was included in the movie, of all those Muhammad Ali documentaries. Bill Greaves himself did several about the Frazier-Ali fight and what that was like as a social event and as a sports event. So the shape that Ali gave to conversation about who we are and what we are, were changing the way we thought about those movies, and so we're still constantly being fed those movies. So I think that's such a great question, because it is this thing that allowed us to follow these thoughts we had about, well, I don't know anybody like Stymie. Why is Mickey Mouse wearing gloves? Is he wearing gloves because he's doing Al Jolson? I mean, all these kinds of things. And probably like me, you have people in your family who are critical thinkers. Like my grandmother would say, "Why are you watching this show with no Black people in it? What do you think happened to that?" And like, oh, I'm 6. Why are you putting this in my head? But it's this way of sort of encountering the world, changing in real time and responding to those real time changes. And I mean, in retrospect, it was a confusing time, but a really exciting and challenging time because as a thinker, it was a thrill to rise to the occasion. And I'm sure you feel the same way.
Well, I had the older cousin watching standard cowboys and Indian movie, and he came in and looked straight at me and said, "Why are you rooting for the cowboy?" I must have been 10. And you know what? Click the switch. It certainly did. Very often, Hollywood, the Black community, the film-going community is not aware, though, that Black folks did, in fact, have a little bit of agency, take some agency at the beginning of cinema. We think about DW and that Klan movie, and we kind of stop there. But there were always Black folks with a camera writing scripts, and you frame that in the film. Talk a little bit about that period as we walk through these decades. Oscar Micheaux and Spencer and everybody.
See, that's the exciting thing to me. Oscar and Spencer and other people I couldn't get included, like Noble Johnson, who did this thing that was a Black film equivalent of the Negro League, which is to say, you go out and you find the funds to make the film, then you cast the film, then you produce and direct, and in some cases star in the film, which you, in so many cases, combine several different genres in because we don't get a chance to make those movies. Then your job is not done. You have to edit the movie and do the post-production. Then your job is not done because you have to go from city to city and book the film in the theaters and do conversations. So again, it's that equivalent of leading a parade to the ball field, then playing 9 innings of baseball, and then selling merchandise and having a big dinner to raise more money for the team, and then dancing your way off the field. That because yeah, you're right. I mean, that's the great thing about this, that people of color weren't waiting for permission, but there's also the awful kind of editorial purview of the studios, which is to not book any of those movies, to just say, we'd rather not have Black money if we have to get it that way. That's okay. And so there was this, as I say in the film, de facto Black underground, cultural and economic, though these movies were being made. And I wanted to show that Spencer Williams clip because for people who do know him, they know him as Kingfish. So to show that astonishing shot of that pastor leading that procession into the camera, I mean, that's as beautiful a shot as anything you're going to see in the movies. And one of the things I wanted to do in this is show all these moments of physical beauty in these Black movies that hadn't been seen before. That you can go from Spencer Williams to Charles Burnett with Bill Grease being in the middle of that. And then what Melvin did. And then Melvin's influence, as far as I'm concerned, I've always seen the influence of Melvin Van Peebles on the work that Michael Mann does. That sort of question, existential question of masculinity, and how does that apply to the world as it's changing around you?
Well, one of the things that you do in the film over and over and over again is juxtapose the work of Charles Burnett and Melvin and all of these other great Black filmmakers against white filmmakers and others who came after them. All of those beautiful representations of Charles Burnett's Killer of Sheep, captured in George Washington, captured in all of the film in the
in House Party, and Martin Scorsese, and Charles Lane doing Sidewalk Stories. Absolutely.
I mean, this represents an absolutely penetrating, or it illustrates how absolutely penetrating these films were. And this is a film that was kept out of theaters because, the copyright issues with the music and all of that stuff for nearly 30 years after it was made. Or something like that. Yet it's still penetrated the zeitgeist overall.
Oh, sure. It's one of those underground films that becomes part of the underground just because of securing those music rights. I mean, there's a lack of sophistication, and now we can say clearly one of those things that wasn't taught in film school. But he still got the movie made, and people still saw it, and and were able to, how best to put this, pay homage to it. I don't want to say that. but to evoke the power of that movie, and when you have that going from David Gordon Green to Martin Scorsese, not to mention the black filmmakers who, you know, and Reggie Hudlin using it for a joke in House Party. I mean, and there's so much of that movie because somebody asked a great question last night that about romance in these movies. I said, there's no better case of romance or example rather of romance than the romance between that husband and wife in Killer of Sheep, where you can see in that dance with that song playing, but also the way he looks at his daughter and sees his wife and his daughter. And the movie's about romance is de facto way because he goes off and takes on this soul-crushing job every day to support his family so he can go home and keep his family together. I mean, I don't think there's any more romantic notion in the history of movies than that.
Yeah, and captured beautifully indeed. Let's roll back to that period that gave us Sidney and Harry in the film. Harry actually in the film. I imagine Sidney was still with us when you were making the film. But and I think right now Sidney, the film about Sidney Poitier, you mentioned Reggie directing that film, there is out in the world right now. Would that be the only reason that Sidney's not in the film alongside Harry Belafonte?
Be honest, we weren't able to get to Sidney, and I also want to ask myself this question too: what can you say about Sidney that hasn't been said? You know what I mean? Because he was the only figure, he got a lot of attention. And in fact, has written about his own struggles and so beautifully. And I haven't seen the documentary yet, so I'm not sure. I don't know what's in it. But I know that was a tough question because for me, Sidney is this interesting lightning rod because he had the most unusual career you could think of. To imagine going from being in 1968 the biggest box office star in the world to 2 years later being irrelevant, not because of choices you made in the movies at that period, but because the world has changed so much that people have turned on you and attacking you as being the cause of the state of Black film rather than just being a symptom of that. I mean, he was castigated for all these reasons that were really myopic, so much so that he was even being attacked in the New York Times. Imagine being a Black person being attacked in the New York Times for being irrelevant. There is no point of comparison for that. And so what does he do? He reinvents himself by placing himself in community. It sort of starts, it's with a warm December. And I met him a few times before that and tried to do interviews with him for various things I was working on. And he would always say no, and then he would talk to me for 2 hours. What no, don't. Let's just go 2 miles over here and sit in front of a microphone. That quote I have at the end of the film, I ran into his daughter, Sydney, at the LA Film Festival about 10 years ago. She goes, "Oh, do you know my dad?" I'm like, "Oh, God." And so she walks me over, "Dad, this is," he goes, "Oh, I know who this young man is." And, oh, boy, I know where this is going. And she says, "Dad, you should do his radio show." "No, I can't do his show." And so then we end up talking for, I'm not kidding, an hour and a half. And finally she walks over and goes, "Dad, just go over and do his show. You're wasting all this time." And these far-ranging conversations that were packed with insight. And I'm just thinking, this is really sad. This is just, this is a particular branch of level of hell for me to be sitting in, to be hearing all this great stuff from this guy who was resolute about not going anywhere else. But then there are times he said, "Well, it'd be great to talk to you, but I'm working on my book and I want to try to save some of the stuff for my book or something else." But in assessing Sidney and his impact, which you can't do in making a movie like this, I had to ask myself, what can I say about him that I haven't seen anybody say before? And then this conversation came, "Oh God, that's right," because I said that to him. And then he responded, "Yeah," because to make 5 films in a row as a director that are all about Black people having to pretend to be somebody else.
Yeah.
I mean, and then the effect that has on the psyche, which is in this meta way dealing with the way that movies have shaped the way Black people are perceived, and coming from somebody who wasn't born in this country. And so I just sort of blurted this thing out. You made 5 movies and they're all about somebody, a Black person acting like something they aren't. He goes, "Well, young man, I have a therapist. I don't need another one." But then he goes on. Yeah.
Look, I'm sure that conversation was had on that therapist couch with Sidney, and it was an astute observation on your part. And it's interesting because then we go to Harry Belafonte, of course, who is in the film. And Harry has always been strident. And which is a thing that I always loved about Harry Belafonte, but it's not a thing that I'm sure that Black folk, particularly back in the day, 70s, 80s, knew about Harry Belafonte. In the 60s, he was right there next to Coretta. But I'm not sure that Black folk of a certain generation understood who Harry Belafonte was because he left the industry so early. Harry's in the movie. Your thoughts about Harry and the way Harry wants to make sure his legacy is maintained?
Well, I mean, for Harry, it's a question of, what does it profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul? And for Harry, the answer to that question is, don't sell out. You can't be these things. And clearly, when you watch Harry Belafonte as a performer, as a singer, he's working on stage as if he's creating characters for those songs. So his actor's training shaped him as a musical performer. And to give up this thing that you trained for, that you wanted more than anything, that you could sort of see success within hailing distance. It's right there, almost within your grasp, but it's that line from Kierkegaard, isn't it? The closer you get to a dream, the more tattered and dusty it becomes. And he didn't want to have the dream realized in that way. It was easier, and it's still striking to me, it was easier for him to not be in movies than to be compromised in that way. And I saw some documentary like a year ago, somebody's going, like those Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier movies, like they were in a couple of movies together. There weren't many. And you're missing, and this is some documentary about, I think it's about Black women in film. Like, who is this person who doesn't know Black history, who's denigrating Harry Belafonte, and the filmmakers going along with it by sticking it in the movie? So they're showing their lack of knowledge. And that's why it's important for me to put this out there. This was a foundational element in telling this story, that somebody like Harry Belafonte, who was a star everywhere but the place where he should have been, rather than subject himself to the compromises that this would demand from me, just go, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to like myself for not doing it, but I'm not going to do it. Because I'll like myself more by not having participated than having to live with the legacy of those compromised decisions.
And of course, Odds Against Tomorrow, which was overlooked at the time, but now it's become something of a classic. It runs on the Noir channel like every 15 minutes. Odds Against Tomorrow. Oh, all the time. All the time. And I talk it up all the time. And Buck and the Preacher has always been a film that I loved. Of course, I was a child when Buck and the Preacher came out. It was not, and Harry talks about this in your film, it received by the Black community at the time. And I just never got it. I just never got why the Black community did not get what was going on in Buck and the Preacher, a film about these two Black men leading their people to freedom, their juxtaposition to the Native American community. And what are your thoughts about Buck and the Preacher? How did you take it at the time?
Gee, I was a kid too, but obviously in retrospect, the idea of a Black cowboy was such an alien concept for people because of what they've been seeing in the movies. I mean, John Wayne was still making cowboy movies at that point. You were getting the revisionist cowboy movies like Bad Company that were trying to say the West was different. Yeah, the West was different. There were Black people in it. So to make a movie set in the West with Black people in it, people are going, in fact, you look at reviews in time, they go, why are Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier and all these other Black people in a cowboy movie? Because there were Black cowboys. It's that thing that's missing. It's this thing that ends up being this fascinating current that runs throughout the movie. We have Sam Jackson and Lawrence Fishburne talking about with his dad, and Margaret Avery and Suzanne DePass talking about wanting a Black cowboy. Because if you had family from the South, at a certain point, you saw a Black person on the horse, on the farm. My grandmother had a working farm, and she had horses there. And so to not see that in the movies didn't make sense. I think it's that thing we were talking about at the beginning, growing up with those compromised, let's be charitable, call them archetypal Black images that excluded so much. As soon as you put a Black person on a horse, well, that Black person has control over its destiny, doesn't he? They have control of, they have agency in their lives. And apparently that could not be shown in those movies. It's okay to have somebody walk out on the porch with lemonade, but to put that person on the horse, well, wait, if they're on a horse, they could leave. So rather than answer that question wasn't even posited. And then as a result, you get something like Paul Thomas Anderson when he made Boogie Nights, talking about creating that character that Don Chico played, Buck, because the idea of a black cowboy was absurd to him. Well, it's absurd because even you, as somebody who's grown up in the movies, are shown this one thing. So the idea of a black cowboy seems like a ridiculously surreal concept, when in fact it happened all the time.
Yeah, man, it's fascinating the way these things sort of play out, and to a certain extent, that notion still exists in the mind of Hollywood anyway. And as we walk through the film and we make our way into that Black exploitation era. First of all, that word, Black exploitation, which has hit Black folks in different ways at different times. What do we think about that word today? And then I'm going to ask you a very, very personal question about being a Black film critic. And that's it right there, right? Black film critic. I don't know about you, Elvis, but when I first became a film critic some 30 odd years ago, I was repulsed by that notion, being a Black film critic. I was a film critic who was Black, a film critic who was Black. And I didn't want anybody calling me a Black film critic 35 years ago. Now I'm like a Black film critic. I'm such a Black film critic. I'm a crazy ass Black film critic. How has these notions affected you, or did they, over the years? Did you go through that turmoil that I went through?
Oh, I didn't, because I just thought, listen, I'm Black and I want to talk about these things because they're just not being talked about. And there's a point where being a Black film critic is like being a talking dog. Like, wow, you can actually do that? So Black people see movies and think about them. Yes, they do. And that has always informed who I am. And I was certain at a certain point was one of the reasons I wasn't getting jobs. I remember as a kid in Detroit, there was an opening for a second string critic at the Detroit Free Press. And the woman who was a film critic that was going to probably make the decision basically sort of like talked down to me like, yeah, like this sort of basic thing, this isn't for you. Like, yeah, I don't care what you think. Because first of all, you're a bad writer and you're a bad critic. If I don't get this, I'll work somewhere else. And just coming up and this period of what we're talking about, that's in the movie, was still fresh in my mind, just because it was something that formed what I am as a thinker and a critic. And I always thought that there was a point of view missing from film criticism. When I was getting started, you had a bunch of these guys with these young fogies who were always espousing the Andrew Sarris auteur theory, and these guys writing about these movies. And to what we're talking about here, so many of the scenes that are in this movie, the clips that I chose were chosen because I thought they were really powerful and beautiful moments that weren't just acclamatory things of Sidney Poitier reminding us that he's the only Black person in the movie, but moments like that, the gorgeous dance in Killer Sheep, or Bill Breeze trying to puzzle out what it is he's trying to do by subverting film narrative, but also wanting to make a good movie in Symbiocycle Taxiplasm, or Diana Ross sauntering in that scene in Mahogany. I mean, these are things that belong in these compendia of the greatest film clips of all times, and that never turn up in that. They never turn.
Max Julian and Vanetta McGee, oh my God. Both of them exquisitely beautiful human beings that should have been the biggest movie stars on earth. Billy D. Williams descending those stairs in Lady Sings the Blues. Every moment of Diana Ross and Mahogany. And in the Black community, these things hit us that way, but your film brings them to us again. Is that Black enough for you? That extraordinary line out of Cotton Comes to Harlem. So just fantastic, man. Fantastic. Elvis, thank you so much.
Oh God, thank you.
This has been great. The movie is fantastic. It's in theaters, I think, starting yesterday, if I'm not mistaken.
I guess it's doing a play date for a week here in New York, and for a week in LA, I think weirdly in Malibu, because that's where.
What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do?
But it's also where Netflix owns a theater, and they could book it in there, so it's playing there for a week. So yes, please go see it. And I can't thank you enough for these really great and considerate questions, and the amount of time you've given and bringing your own career into play in this conversation. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
You've been informing us for a long time now. Me specifically, thank you so much for this film. Is that Black enough for you? Elvis Mitchell. There's nobody clapping but me, but I don't care.
He's still buzzing from the coffee, folks. 3 cups of coffee and a piece of chocolate.
And a piece of chocolate. Thank you, brother.
All right, thank you, man. Take care.